it a much more embodied notion, an embodied and material notion of what the city itself means to people living here, means to the migrants who are living here, and how they actually relate and connect to different parts and spaces of the city.
Oh, you know carbon sales? Yeah. I'm mad about carbon sales. I like very much. In 1989, when I started to go first time there, mostly Sundays, I visited 3 of them. One
buying, not selling.
No, buying. In Leytonstone, one.
Oh, yeah.
Another in Shepherd's Bush, and another in Hounslow. Then
so this is I think I wanted to put this here because it shows not just people coming into London, but also, it's not just settlement, but also return. And this particular migrant, I forget his name, he came to London again as he was illegal for many years, for about 10 years or so, before he's now become legal, before 2004. And he, again, is much more empowered. He's a contractor who employs a large number of new Polish migrants, and he has this building contracting job. But he's recently been gifted a piece of land near Krakow in the hills, and he has begun to build his house there in Poland. And he's become this real addict of visiting car boot sales all across London. And if you know these areas, they're all in different parts of London, so it's not in just one area. So he's gone to Shepherd's Bush and Hounslow and Leytonstone, and he's collecting artifacts from there. And what he says is that when he goes back to his house, when his house is built in Poland, he's going to decorate it with these artifacts that he's collecting from London. So one reason for that is, of course, because he wants to remember London, remember his time in London. Not that he wants to live in that house, but he wants to give it as a gift to his son when his son grows up. So it's not about his own living there, not about his own habitation. So it's a house built in his absence, or a house inhabited in his absence. So it's going to be decorated by these artifacts that he's collecting from the car boot sales. But also, the other reason he gives us, during the socialist era, most of that locality and mobility, or situatedness and mobility, can exist in simultaneity with each other during migration. So for me, I think visuality is also a very important part of this, because not just as a methodological tool, but to me it allowed the participants to articulate their complex experiences of negotiating the spatial and temporal fracturing of their homes and their homelands. Which are often constructed as mundane and ordinary, but they are very critical to the global city narrative. And these are the narratives that are not included when we talk about transnational cities or global cities, when we talk about economic growth and remittances and all of those kinds of things which make migration studies what it is today. And so the translocal connections that are made through these visual narratives are constructed from a range of mobilities, as hopefully I have been able to show, across the nation state, across cities, across urban neighborhoods, across homes left behind and homes being made in a new place. They do show a heightened sense of situatedness, and perhaps that's to do with the nature of photographs, because their photographs are about buildings, they are about places and landscapes and people. And they show this situatedness in particular localities where connections are made through very embodied, affective, and material experiences that again constructs a sense of a translocal city, an embodied notion of a city, rather than an imagined notion of a city for the participants. And the sustenance of everyday life through these translocal links reworks and transforms urban life in the city, which is part of the last few slides, where London itself is being changed in the perception of the participants themselves. So what does it mean to visualize the everyday city in terms of transnationalism, in terms of migration? I think beyond what we can say about translocality and the critiques that we can provide of the global city through that, the visual narratives also, I think, in their own right, they provide a creative expression to the negotiations that migrants themselves make between the imagined global city and they experience translocal city. And the translocal connections that they make through these visual narratives are, as I said before, constructed across a range of spaces, places, and scales. And these scales are not, again, structured scales. These are scales which are continuously negotiated and constructed. For me, what was very important is that the participants were able to actually take a role in shaping the research story. And that, to me, I think is crucial in terms of doing this kind of research, where participants should have a voice. I'm not making claims to complete participatory research in this case, although I would have liked it to be. So they were not part of the research design, but they were certainly part of making the research story. So it allowed them, it gave them the opportunity to be self-reflexive and self-aware, but also highlight what was more important for them, rather than me setting the rules and rather than me imposing the framework of priorities and importance. So they were able to highlight the meanings and consequences of their own movements on their own terms through these photographs. And these photographs, therefore, they induced ideas of movement, settlement, and return, and they also allowed participants to find a sense of attachment and belonging, or create or articulate a sense of attachment and belonging within the wider notions of marginalization and alienation that they might feel, particularly in places like building sites or even in the city per se. Okay, I'll just leave some of the publications, but I'm happy to take questions. Thank you.
Yes, if local contexts matter, which you argue, particularly for images, the Polish immigrants, images of London, and if translocal city is your framing, then can you provide me with direct evidence in the form of spatial network maps about translocal contacts that Polish workers have in terms of daily activities? 1, working. 2, living, housing. 3, socializing, pubs. 4, shopping. Because if you provide me those maps of translocal contexts, then you could interpret those maps in terms of, are they beginning to frame London in terms of East London neighborhoods, North London neighborhoods, Earl's Court, Hammersmith, places that I used to live? I didn't see evidence about how images were being formed. I just saw results of those.
If I understand you correctly, you're asking for actual maps as in connectors. I'm trying to understand what you mean by maps, because the maps that are there are the mental maps and the ways that they narrate the connections. So if you think about the connections in terms of building site, and I couldn't show as much of those images given the scope of this, but a lot of the narratives were about the type of insulation they would use, the type of bricks in London versus concrete blocks in Poland or wherever they were familiar with. So there were all of those discussions about the difference. So the translocality or the local connections they were making often were based on a social construction of difference through which they were able to argue that Polish is better. And I've argued elsewhere that this construction was mainly based on a response to the larger marginalization that they often faced in the building sites. When it came to the homes, then often the homes, again, were about what the kinds of layouts and arrangements were there in Polish homes where people would enter, and there wouldn't necessarily be, let's say, a living room or a dining room, that each room might have a bed. And so they would talk about that, and they would say that, well, we don't really have a problem sharing homes because we have converted the dining room or the living room also into another bedroom. So there were lots of those kinds of evidences, which of course I can't get into in this. But yes. Oh, I see. Okay.
I think it's also looking for something like a network analysis.
I see. No, this is a very qualitative research, so I wouldn't be able to show you any demographic analysis. But those kinds of data is there in the Home Office, and I certainly used a lot of that.
But if you had shown, for instance, what you were just going through, that is the construction materials of their home villages in Poland, and then their image of superiority or inferiority of building in London, it's different if you're building in West London than if you're building in some of the if they're working in some of the high-income areas in London, and so on about trash, and so on about, shared living environments. So I would argue that localities in London do make a lot of difference about establishing perceptions, and that it is the perception, it is the reference group perception in villages in Poland, because you indicated they didn't come from Krakow, they didn't come from Warsaw, so. Or if they're moving within London.
Yeah, I think you and
what
I are on the same
between?
page. It's, I think what you're asking for is more of a listing of those kinds of things. And my intention was not necessarily to show a list per se, but to really see how these are both social and material. So there's a lot of social construction of it, because we can't just say that Polish is better. It was really their perception and their construction of Polishness is superior in many ways than the British, which I have argued that it was partly to do with how they were placing themselves in wider British society.
It also looks to me like that kind of data is probably available in the municipality.
Yeah, yeah.
Whereas the perception is what's difficult to get.
Yes.
You need
Yeah.
to kind of talk to
Yeah,
people.
that's where I was thinking. That's where I'm really trying to get at. I think the Home Office data, what is called the kind of the statistics, and they did keep a very strong list of the number of Polish migrants, Polish and East European migrants were coming in. So that data is very publicly available. So I used that, and there's also the construction data, which shows that after 2004 there was suddenly a big rise in the graph of the Polish and East European migrants. So there is all that data, but I didn't show that purposely because, well, there is a certain limit of time, but also my focus is more about the social construction of translocality.
Yeah, well, it was a very interesting presentation and quite interdisciplinary. But I was just wondering, now you were presenting data basically on the kind of, I would say, static environment, in the sense their existing situation. But do you find anything that they try to aspire to, I mean, in the future, like in terms of their buildings? Like now, when they construct buildings, they are big buildings, definitely. They are not small. So through those, did you see any kind of aspiration or motivation to go higher, climb higher in their social ladder? Because they start with laborers. So I didn't see anything like that coming through the presentation.
Do you have 3 hours? I saw that a lot. There was this whole section in my questionnaire or research about future and future homes. And it was very interesting because, and I alluded to that slightly, there was a lot of discussion about the future and future home and future homeland, belonging to a future homeland, through inhabitation in absence. And this was more to do with what they would leave behind for the future generations rather than inhabiting themselves. So many of them actually said that we are here, our children are studying here, we're not going to go back unless the economy changes. So it's interesting now that you hear that a lot of Polish people have actually gone back to Poland. The Polish economy is picked up and the British economy is completely slumped. So many of them would have gone back, but I think most of those whose children were younger and they had come with their children, didn't want to go back, but the children were studying. So they were, like the last example I gave, they were building their houses. They were definitely interested in building. And this goes back to my answer to the last question, that they always suggested that if they were to have a house, own a house, they would own it in their homeland. And so the homeland itself was presented as superior through its very materiality. So they would say London soil is very clayey, and so the buildings have all cracks in them, and I'm really surprised how the buildings haven't fallen down. Whereas the Polish soil is mountainous, it's strong, it's got rocks, and you build something on it, it stays for years and years. And so they were all sort of making this argument about its very technical, material nature of it, but through which they were showing this kind of preference for homeland and building a home there. And so none of them were interested in buying anything in London or in the UK. They were all taking this money and investing back in Poland in a land which they were planning to build a house later, or they were buying, let's say, a flat or a house in Poland. So it was all about the future. But this was the people that I talked to, they all realized that they perhaps would never actually inhabit it. And they said, one of them actually said, this is the role of the Polish man, a house and a child and a tree. And this was a metaphor that I used in somewhere else when I was writing, and it was very interesting. It sort of showed the reproduction of family and values and family life, and this is what they saw that they were giving. And so the notion of the future, notion of aspiration and mobility was related to whether they were going to be able to build this house back home, which they would give to the future generation. The notion of mobility in the UK was about going up the ladder in the building site. And most of them